As Star Fox floats in indeterminate space, memories of its prime often come to mind. The sharp wit of its pilots, the memorable worlds you are pulled into, the skill you are encouraged to develop in order to see the game in its entirety. You'd think that Star Fox would prosper for years to come, but instead, it now feels like a distant dream. But why does it have to be this way? If you're a fan of Star Fox, you probably have at least some idea of why the series never really kept its momentum going after Star Fox 64. Of Nintendo's in-house flagship series, Star Fox was one of the few recognizable names to fall into a seemingly endless cycle of mixed reception and disappointments. Nearly all of them misfires after what should have been the birth of a successful franchise. Nintendo and its studios have this incredible ability to take existing genres and not only nail them, but also put their own unique spin on them that make them stand out as definitive classics in those genres. Fire Emblem as a tactical RPG is simple and complex in just the right ways, through its rock-paper-scissors combat triangle and the stakes at play in each battle due to permadeath and the desire to strengthen the relationships between your units. Pikmin streamlines real-time strategy by making you an active participant in exploration and combat, rather than just supervising your units as you make decisions. And it also incorporates elements of action-adventure games, like environmental puzzles. Star Fox was always more than just a rail shooter in that regard. It gave players agency over where they wanted to go, and how they wished to experience the game as they improved at it, all the while being mechanically sound and almost endlessly replayable. But it never reclaimed that former glory. It experimented for sure, but it could never quite soar through the far reaches of space like it did in the late 90s. It's perplexing, almost frustrating, that Star Fox continually failed to do this because the foundation Star Fox 64 laid was truly brilliant. So then, why? Out of both a nostalgic longing for the series and out of curiosity, I replayed every mainline Star Fox game, and I feel I learned a lot about how the series ended up where it is today. More than that though, I feel Star Fox is an excellent franchise for the intricacies of games discussion and the vitriol that comes with someone disliking something they paid money for. Every game after Star Fox 64 is divisive in some way, some more divisive than others. Star Fox Assault divided people on its controls, its emphasis on alternative gameplay styles, and its lack of player agency. Command was less about on-rail shooting and more so about blending real-time strategy with flight combat action, and that structure has caveats. Adventures wasn't even a Star Fox game, but its approach to the action-adventure genre and its handling of what could have been one of Rare's most compelling games is still a point of discussion today. And Star Fox Zero is the poster child for a divisive video game. Star Fox means a lot to me, and I think there's so much left to be done with it. So let's take a journey through the history of Star Fox as I attempt to decipher the place each game has in the series and figure out where things could go from here. I'm Liam Triforce, and this is a Star Fox Retrospective. Let's begin with the story of how Star Fox began in the first place, and how the foundation for its most memorable game was built.
Good luck!
Our journey begins with Argonaut Software, a now-defunct British game development studio founded by Jez San in the 80s. There he created the flight combat simulator Starglider and its sequel for home computers like the Amiga and ZX Spectrum. While the first game displayed its graphics in a wireframe format, the second game showcased impressive real-time polygonal graphics for 1988, solidifying their experience with 3D games. Shortly thereafter, they created a demo for the Game Boy that effortlessly defeated Nintendo's copyright protection on the console. It also featured a tech demo that impressed executive Don James at the Consumer Electronics Show back then. This demonstration led Don to set up a meeting between Jez and then President of Nintendo of Japan, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Argonaut's first project with Nintendo was X for the Game Boy. Jez commissioned Dylan Cuthbert, whose name would be forever connected to the Star Fox series from here, after he showcased an impressive 3D wireframe engine. From there, Star Fox entered early development as a collaborative effort between a design team led by Shigeru Miyamoto and the technical team at Argonaut, including Jez himself, and programmers Dylan Cuthbert and Giles Goddard. Nintendo handled the core game design and art, while Argonaut implemented their design ideas and built the engine. In early discussions, Miyamoto showed Argonaut a prototype of what became Pilot Wings for the Super Nintendo, which used Mode 7 to simulate a three-dimensional viewpoint, but yearned for something more substantial, actual 3D graphics. Argonaut had developed a prototype called NES Glider, which was then ported to the Super Nintendo, to which Nintendo claimed that 3D wasn't going to get much better on the Super Nintendo as the console was not designed with 3D in mind. Jez pitched the idea of developing a custom chip for 3D accelerated graphics, and Nintendo agreed. This led to the development of the Super FX chip, which would not only power Star Fox, but also certain effects in Nintendo's own Yoshi's Island, as well as Stunt Race FX, and even the Super Nintendo port of Doom. It would be built into the motherboard of game cartridges that required the hardware, rather than being built into the console itself, which kept the cost of the console low. This in and of itself is wild to consider today. Imagine buying a Nintendo Switch cartridge now that had hardware built into it that allowed it to function. What you're seeing here is a 1992 prototype for what eventually became Star Fox, demonstrating an early grasp on Argonaut's ability to achieve polygonal graphics on the Super Nintendo. Though the prototype shares a name with Argonaut's flight combat game, its design is way closer to a rail shooter like Space Harrier. Nintendo suggested this style, and in the end, I believe it was the far more accessible and enjoyable choice. Star Fox's game design and characters are the result of three people: Shigeru Miyamoto himself, Katsuya Eguchi, and artist Takeya Imamura, who also created Captain Falcon for F-Zero, and whom I personally respect a great deal for his work on The Legend of Zelda. He was the art director for Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and is responsible for introducing Tingle to the world. When designing games, Miyamoto often looks to evoke experiences and emotions from his own life. Zelda was famously born from his desire to emulate his childhood adventures into caves near his home. Star Fox, on the other hand, drew inspiration from a place he often visited near his place of work, a 15-minute walk from Nintendo's headquarters. Fushimi Inari Taisha, located in Kyoto, is famous for its Senbon Tori, a series of hundreds of gates that began appearing during the Edo period out of a desire for wishes to come true, or out of gratitude for wishes that came true. Flying through gates would become a staple of Star Fox's design, as flying through them often rewards you with health, power-ups, additional enemies to fight, and in Star Fox 64's case, even alternate routes through the game itself. Something about flying a ship through a series of gates just seemed to click immediately, as it tests you on a basic skill that is required in order to survive the game's levels. Also, Fushimi Inari is adorned with a statue of a fox, which are regarded as messengers and are often found at Inari shrines, as Inari Okami is considered the deity of foxes in the Shinto religion. This fox happened to provide Miyamoto with the inspiration for the protagonist of this game. He was disinterested in the typical science fiction fare in contemporary Japanese media, with humans, robots, and superheroes, and since he had already been drawing animal characters for a long time, it seemed like the right choice. With the game's various gates already resembling Fushimi Inari, according to Miyamoto, when you think of Fushimi Inari, you think of foxes. Takeya Imamura got to work on the idea. He designed the 4 pilots of the Star Fox team after employees around the office. Fox's look and personality was based on Miyamoto himself. According to Imamura, Miyamoto had a fox-like face. Falco was based on shape designer Tsuyoshi Watanabe, while Peppy was based on game director Katsuya Eguchi, due to his, quote, hair-like mouth. Slippy was based on assistant director Yoichi Yamada, and he even implied that Andross was inspired by his boss at the time, the late Hiroshi Yamauchi. While the design team was formulating ideas for the game, Argonaut was working away at an 8 or 9 hour time difference from the Kyoto offices, which made sending and responding to faxes a bit tricky. This led to the team being flown out to Japan for lengthy stays pretty often. Dylan Cuthbert and Giles Goddard recalled that they were kept in a room separate from the rest of Nintendo's offices, as they were not full-time employees at the time, and they did not want them to know about their top-secret projects. Despite this, Miyamoto would visit the team often as they worked. You might think that this is a nice gesture, but in reality it might be because this room was the only place in the building that he was allowed to smoke, as he was a heavy smoker at the time. He would walk in while the team were working, light up, and start rambling about trees or some other completely disconnected topic. This is one of my favorite stories about Miyamoto from back in the day. Dylan and Giles later admitted that the thoughts often running through his head are exactly what make him a creative genius. Though I don't always agree with his decisions, I'm inclined to agree on that front. His ability to associate ideas with fun, practical game design is something I'll always admire. Using those gates as a central design element for Star Fox is the kind of thing I strive to do when creating stuff. Oh, and Miyamoto has since quit smoking altogether, just so you know. Star Fox debuted at the 1993 Consumer Electronics Show, and it was released later that year. Beyond the technical achievement that it was also a great game. If you couldn't already tell, both Argonaut and Nintendo loved Star Wars. Upon pressing start on the title screen, you'll be able to choose a control scheme that is most comfortable to you and play around with it in the corner of the screen. It also features an optional training minigame in which you can fly through rings to further acclimate to the game. Being a fast-paced rail shooter with graphics no one had really seen on a home console at this point, beginning the game like this was a great call. Additionally, Star Fox's difficulty select is unique in that each level of difficulty brings you through different levels after Corneria, meaning that replaying the game on a higher difficulty is encouraged if you'd like to see all of it. Later rail shooters like Sin and Punishment would adopt this, pushing players to both enjoy the game at their own pace and to get good at it in order to see more. Star Fox 64 would also brilliantly expand on these paths, as I'm sure most of you are aware. But no matter what difficulty you choose first, you will always begin your journey to Venom in Corneria. As Star Fox is ushered out of the base through these flatly textured and wireframe-laden tunnels, we fade to Corneria and are accompanied by one of the most kick-ass first-level themes in video game history. Star Fox's game design is incredibly simple but remarkably effective. You fly forward and shoot like in any rail shooter, while flying through rings to refill your health and collecting power-ups to shoot better and bomb groups of enemies. You can pick up dual lasers for your R-Wing, but you can lose them if you lose your wing by getting shot or clipping obstacles too many times. What ties the gameplay together are the flashing weak points on large enemies that beg to be shot, and how the game aims to make it difficult for you to do that very thing. And this is true for any Star Fox game that aims to follow up on the gameplay of this one. At the end of each level is a boss that serves to test you on both movement and accuracy. You'll be flying through an entire armada of enemy ships, shooting and dodging along the way, and even infiltrating the inside of massive battleships trying not to bang your ship off of its interior. You'll be going into first person and training your accuracy as you fly through an asteroid field, trying to hit as many things as possible so that you don't crash your R-Wing, with the boss also testing you on this kind of accuracy. You might even have to solve puzzles along the way, like in Titania, in which you have to take the correct path, after collecting power-ups if you'd like, in order to reveal the planet's true appearance. The final level, Venom, is essentially a harder approach to the shooting and flying present in Corneria, with Andross himself being the greatest test of all. I also still find it hilarious that Andross appears to you as if he's made out of paper mache, and then his final form is just a cube with his face on each side. There's a distinct charm to this game's primitive 3D graphics. It looks almost as though you're shooting at a bunch of paper airplanes or origami figures, while you yourself look like a paper aircraft too. But the sharp simplicity of the R-Wing design led to its key visual elements persisting across every game in the series. The environments just barely have enough geometry, sprites, and textures to resemble the kind of atmosphere each planet is supposed to have, but that's exactly what makes them so impressive for the time, and charming to look back on today. Mechanically speaking, what is unique to this game as a rail shooter, especially for the time, are the tools in place to give you an edge. You can barrel roll in order to deflect projectiles and dodge, and you can use bombs wisely to take out groups of enemies swiftly, or deal a ton of damage to a boss's weak point. You also have to consider the well-being of your wingmen, because they will help you deal with enemies and reward you if you manage to keep them alive. If they go down, they will not return until you either defeat Andross or lose all of your lives and start a new game. The wingmen are the core of Star Fox's identity, both through their utilization as a game mechanic and their contributions to it being such a memorable game. Their cuddly puppet-like appearances, inspired a little bit by Thunderbirds, as well as their banter in-game, give the game an atmosphere beyond flying and shooting. I mean, I guess I wouldn't call the box art depictions of them cuddly, but I find them cuddly when I look at them in-game at least. All of these features gave the gameplay of Star Fox more depth than even something like Space Harrier, and it makes pursuing subsequent playthroughs and improving at the game a lot of fun. Now, although I said that you can choose your path through the difficulty you select, there are actually 2 secret warps in this game. One of them functions like a warp zone, as you can take one of the black holes in this area to warp to different levels on the board. The other leads to an extremely goofy secret boss. In the level 3 asteroid field, if you fly into this bird-like enemy, you will be warped to a new area. I don't know how they expected players to figure this out, considering it has a flashing weak point like any other enemy, so your first instinct would probably be to shoot the hell out of it. But it is a completely unique enemy, so I understand how people might have stumbled upon this accidentally or otherwise. You'll end up flying through a stage called Out of This Dimension, which is a trip to say the least. It goes on like this for a little while before you encounter a giant slot machine, and in order to defeat it, you have to get a jackpot, upon which you'll be granted a ton of coins, and the game will end prematurely. Imagine stumbling upon this place by pure accident after bumping into that bird. Anyway, warps would also be fleshed out significantly in Star Fox 64. The only real gripe I have with Star Fox now is its performance. The team went to great strides to make it not just a technical marvel for its time, but also a really fun and engaging shooter. The problem is that the Super Nintendo can just barely handle its awesomeness. On many occasions, the game slows to a crawl, which is disorienting. I also find the primitive 3D graphics to not accurately give me the information my eyes need to perceive depth well, leading to me getting hit by a lot of stuff that I otherwise wouldn't be. Couple this with the lack of a reticle, and it can get frustrating. I mean, even Afterburner had a reticle for aiming, and that was in the 80s. I can usually project where my shots are going to land, but it's an art that is difficult to master with this game's performance and visuals. It can be done, but it requires a lot of patience. Either way, that's all I have to say on the original Star Fox. It went beyond being a technical showcase, being an enjoyable rail shooter with its own identity and refreshing, original ideas for the time. I would go as far to say that it played a huge part in the revitalization of the genre for home consoles, as its approach to difficulty led to it being accessible to newcomers, as well as encouraging them to improve and take on each path. All of this would be extremely important to the series as it continued, though much like the paths you can take in Star Fox 64, further development on the Star Fox series was anything but straightforward. Work on Star Fox 2 began almost immediately after Star Fox was completed. Argonaut was contracted to make 3 games, Star Fox being one of them. The others were Stunt Race FX and, of course, Star Fox 2. Miyamoto and Eguchi returned to supervise and direct, respectively. Dylan Cuthbert stayed in Kyoto as lead programmer on the project, while 2 programmers at Nintendo worked under him. Star Fox 2 used a souped-up version of the Super FX chip, dubbed the Super FX 2, which could make 3D calculations twice as fast as the original chip. This chip was implemented not just to make the game look better, but also to enable a feature that was intended for the original game, but left out due to limitations: all range mode. Apparently the first game was never intended to be limited to just rail shooter gameplay, and it was originally going to have free 360-degree movement like other flight combat games. The team also wanted to employ something of a roguelike structure, and while no procedural generation was used in the game, no playthrough is quite the same as the last thanks to its real-time strategy structure and the multiple ways in which you can take care of enemies while defending Corneria, as well as the large assortment of bosses that can appear. Miyamoto fully embraced the idea, as he considered Star Fox a great place to experiment with new ideas. Remember that, folks, we'll be seeing a lot of experimentation as we move forward. Another of these new ideas was the Walker, which the R-Wing would transform into in order to infiltrate enemy bases. Though Star Fox 2 had a mostly successful showcase at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1995, some found it to be unimpressive, especially in the face of the next generation of consoles. I think I can see why. For one thing, Donkey Kong Country breathed new life into the Super Nintendo's capabilities through pre-rendered 3D models being presented as sprites, and it brought us these gorgeous scenic jungle levels that made it such a beautiful game. On top of that, the PlayStation and Sega Saturn were set to release that year. There wasn't really much to write home about in terms of rudimentary flat-textured 3D polygons in 1995, when Panzer Dragoon was slated to release the same year. It's still extremely impressive work for the Super Nintendo, but it was definitely overshadowed at the time. Nintendo took notice of this and decided to prioritize the Nintendo 64. They cancelled Star Fox 2 shortly thereafter, though the game was still allowed to be finished, and even taken through QA testing. After that, it sat in Nintendo's archives for over 20 years. Supposedly, Super FX games have been historically difficult for Nintendo to get working on their emulators, as the original Star Fox was never re-released on the Wii, 3DS, or Wii U Virtual Console. Not even the original Yoshi's Island received a re-release, only its Game Boy Advance port. Over the years, multiple ROM images of Star Fox 2 leaked onto the internet. The complexity of the Super FX chip, as well as the historical significance of this ROM, led to the community developing a more reliable emulation of the chip itself, solving Nintendo's problem for them in the process. This was how I first played Star Fox 2, though I recall the build I played being much less stable than the version we have now. In 2017, Nintendo stated in an interview with Famitsu that the Super FX problem had been solved, and that Yoshi's Island and Star Fox would be re-released for the first time on the Super NES Classic. In addition, Star Fox 2 would see an official release on the console, complete with an English script. All 3 games would also hit Nintendo Switch Online in 2019. Finally releasing Star Fox 2 was an unprecedented move, and to this day I still applaud them for it. They even created a digital manual for the game, complete with new artwork from Imamura. You can clearly see the influence American Comics had on his design and rendering style for both this and F-Zero, and this pretty much gave him free rein to illustrate an atmosphere for a game that almost was, and now is. As far as the game itself goes, remember how Miyamoto considered Star Fox a testing ground for new ideas? Well, it feels more like that than it does a complete experience, and it's a good thing Star Fox 64 was born from it. That being said, Star Fox 2 is still a good game. The basic premise is that you have one single map, and you have to defend Corneria from incoming attacks and clear out enemy bases before battling Andross. In a pseudo-real-time strategy setup, you must fly towards each enemy base and infiltrate it, all the while taking out enemies and missiles all over the map, and being intercepted by members of Starwolf. Corneria does have its own defense measures, but you need to make sure it doesn't take too much damage, otherwise the game is over. While you and your buddy are moving, everything else is also moving, and time doesn't stop when you enter a battle. It slows down, but it still continues to move. You can actually abandon certain battles to intercept things that are getting too close to Corneria if you wish, although you really don't want to put yourself in that position, as it means you'll have wasted your time. As far as real-time strategy goes, this is not only a fun and accessible game in the face of the genre itself, something that Nintendo would later explore with Pikmin, it also blends with Star Fox's gameplay quite elegantly. Due to the possibilities for what can spawn and where, no 2 playthroughs will be quite the same. When infiltrating enemy bases, you'll transform into the Walker in order to take out barriers and explore labyrinthine layouts. Its tank controls might take some getting used to, but they get the job done. Once you've taken out everything on the map, you'll have to head into Andross's base and take him on. The game is designed to be replayed multiple times in order to witness different outcomes, but I found that I didn't really want to. Star Fox 2 lacks that grand sense of intergalactic adventure that the first game was driven by. It is something else entirely. I have no doubt that this game will gel with some, and I do think it is a good game, but I found its intense focus on all range battles to be tiresome, especially considering the fact that the original game was entirely on rails. Granted, there are a ton of different bosses you can encounter on each playthrough, but I feel it lacks the initial pull that the original Star Fox had. On top of that, the Walker segments can get really repetitive when you go through them multiple times, unless they throw a boss into the mix. It's usually the same rhythm each time. Ultimately, I'm content with most of Star Fox 2's ideas having been reworked into 64, because this feels more like a build of a game that they were experimenting with, rather than a finished product. Which makes sense, the game was cancelled. I'm not surprised it feels that way, but I've heard that the game was practically complete, at least according to Dylan Cuthbert. Thankfully, if you were a fan of this game's RTS structure, there is a game later in this series that significantly fleshes out its approach to the genre, and I feel it is a much better game for it. It has a similar problem to this game when it comes to the core gameplay variety, but it features many maps and routes for you to experience. It's also absolutely wild and hilarious for the wrong reasons. More on that later. What I will say is that Argonaut deserved to have their work released in some capacity, and I'm glad that Star Fox 2 is finally out there in a presentable, playable form. But that notion of this game being something different entirely due to Miyamoto's philosophy of testing ideas with Star Fox would end up foreshadowing the future of the franchise.
Good luck.
After Star Fox 2 was cancelled, Nintendo decided to develop the next Star Fox game in-house, meaning that Argonaut was cut loose. That said, programmer Giles Goddard stayed with Nintendo, programming Mario's face on the title screen of Mario 64, and he worked with fellow Argonaut colleague Colin Reed on 1080 Avalanche. Dylan Cuthbert stayed with Argonaut, but he would return to the Star Fox series years later. Star Fox 64 needs no introduction. This is the game that we are all here for, and for good reason. Interestingly enough, the game is a retelling of the original Star Fox. Andross was banished to the wasteland planet Venom, wherein he established a military base to invade the Lylat system. What is factored in here is the inclusion of Starwolf member Pigma Dengar in the game's backstory, as he lured both Fox's father James McCloud and Peppy into a trap. While Peppy managed to escape, James did not. James's fate was only briefly touched upon in the original game, but tying a Starwolf member to the fate of Fox's father has been a really fascinating touch. Among the members of Starwolf, Pigma seems to be the least sane mercenary of the four of them. Pigma taunts Fox over James's death at any opportunity. In contrast, Wolf and Leon in particular are calm and collected, as though they are only in it to have an opportunity to go toe-to-toe with their rivals. After all, Starwolf are mercenaries hired to stop Star Fox from reaching Andross. With the exception of Andrew, who is Andross's nephew, they are merely following orders and getting paid. I think this is part of the reason a lot of people connected with Wolf from the first time they saw him. I mean, of course, he has an eye patch, and any character with an eye patch is automatically cool and mysterious. More than that, though, he isn't necessarily a villain. He's simply a rival, a hired gun. And that kind of dynamic is the reason I am always excited when he shows up and says,
"I can't let you do that, Star Fox."
The most memorable aspect of Star Fox 64 isn't just the abundance of fully voiced dialogue. It was incredible at the time, but it isn't just the fact that it's there. It's the fact that nearly every line in this game is quotable. Almost every single one-liner has left a firm imprint on my mind. The gold just pours out of these characters' mouths. It also probably helps that each line is delivered with this perfect balance between hammy and genuinely great cartoonish voice acting, to the point where the cadence in which each line is delivered becomes memorized as well. I don't think this game's dialogue will ever be topped, partially due to the impact it left at the time of its release, but also because it exists in this bubble of innovation, purity, and cheesiness that you couldn't replicate if you tried. It's simply perfect, and it has seeped into popular culture, to the point where my dad, who hasn't played much of anything since the golden age of arcades, references Do a Barrel Roll to this day. Pour one out for Rick May. He delivered one of the most memorable lines in video game history. I think most of us can recite the entire script for Corneria by heart, which has a lot to do with the fact that you always start the game with Corneria, and a lot to do with the fact that the level is brilliant. Star Fox 64 is immediately more fun to play than the Super Nintendo games, thanks to the addition of analog control, and a targeting reticle lifted from Star Fox 2 that accurately shows where your shots will land. And it turns just the right amount as you steer your ship, so that if you choose to fire a barrage of uncharged shots, you can essentially trigger finger enemy ships until they explode. I tended to do this a lot in the all-range mode battles, as charging a shot and hoping it tracks isn't always fast or reliable enough, especially in the fights with Starwolf where they can barrel roll to deflect your shots and somersault. The barrel roll itself has also been improved, in which you have a clear visual indicator of when it is active via the after images of your ship's wings. And the lock-on shot is super helpful for saving your wingmen from being chased by the fast-moving small fry that tend to latch onto them, among other things like delivering large, focused blasts to the larger enemies. Corneria is both a testing ground for you to play with your new techniques and controls, and a place to test yourself on your abilities. It is simultaneously a great introduction, and also one of the more difficult stages to achieve a medal once you get good enough at the game. It starts you off by taking you over the ocean as you head toward Corneria City. There are only a few enemies here to shoot down, and you can obtain dual lasers early on if you shoot this group of ships. Much like the first game, you can upgrade your lasers to shoot 2 at a time, and again to deal twice as much damage per shot. This makes firing those uncharged laser shots without lock-on even more rewarding with the fully upgraded lasers, because if you can aim your shots just right, you can absolutely decimate any opponent you come across. After this, Peppy calls out,
Slippy, watch out! Bogey on your tail!
You need to act fast with either well-aimed lasers or a charged shot in order to save Slippy, otherwise he'll sustain some massive damage. This is an incredibly effective in-game introduction to the importance of keeping your wingman alive, as there isn't much going on, so most new players can feasibly save Slippy, provided they played the training mode first. But if they fail to save him, the game immediately demonstrates the impact that has. Later on in the level, Falco takes some shots too, and if you fail to save him there, he will more than likely be taken down, leaving you down a wingman until the level after the next. This game mercifully does not take your wingman out for good, as that would be incredibly punishing for the length and complexity of the levels, and the length and difficulty of any given playthrough. Even so, it is in your best interest to keep them alive, as you might struggle to fulfill certain objectives without them. Not to mention, it's rewarding to keep them alive. After the game funnels you through a corridor, you enter Corneria City, where the game really opens up. You can fly through all sorts of buildings and formations to find new enemies to shoot down, fly through 3 golden rings to focus on getting your health and lives up, or just aim to survive. All the while, Peppy will continue to shout suggestions at you when you've got enemies surrounding you. There's a lot to focus on here, but that's what makes it such a well-designed level. You don't necessarily have to go for a high score the first time you play through it, but when you do want to earn that medal, your intuition over flying through formations is consistently rewarded, as is your aim. On an average playthrough, the focus only needs to be on survival, extra lives, and finding alternate routes. This is Star Fox 64's claim to fame. The branching pathways through its main story are to this day one of the most creative ways of structuring dynamic difficulty, and encouraging player ingenuity. While some of the requirements for finding each route can be a little cryptic, others are brilliant and reward you for both skill and thinking differently about each level. On this section over the water, you'll no doubt spot these formations that you can fly through to collect health rings. If you fly through the first group of them, Falco will say,
Pretty smooth flying, Fox.
Provided that you didn't get him killed earlier. This is meant to clue you into something big, because if you fly through the second group, Falco will take you through an alternate route behind the waterfall, where you'll find an entirely different boss than the all-range one you normally fight. By defeating this boss, you'll head towards Sector Y instead of Meteo, rewarding you for your attentiveness. Star Fox 64 is full of moments like this, rewarding you for both ingenuity and skill. When you're flying through the asteroids and enemy ships in Sector Y, if you manage to score 100 hits or more, you'll keep heading along the hard route to Aquis. If not, you'll be sent to Katina. The cool thing about this, though, is that it could also be a deliberate choice. Aquis is one of a few levels that has you pilot something other than your R-Wing. In this case, a submarine. It essentially controls like a more sluggish version of the R-Wing, except it has an infinite supply of torpedoes. The level moves at a much slower pace than a typical on-rails level, even when considering the Landmaster. While some might consider it the worst level in Star Fox 64, that really isn't saying much because it's still pretty good. The point of all of this, though, is that if you don't like Aquis, you can avoid this route altogether either in Corneria or Sector Y, simply by not following Falco in the first place, or deliberately not getting a high score. By heading to Katina, you'll play what is essentially the Independence Day level, in which the iconography is eerily similar to the alien spaceship hovering over Manhattan. You can choose either the easy or hard route off of Katina, heading to Solar if you take down all 4 of the ship's hatches before it shoots its laser, or to Sector X. The former has you flying through a sea of lava, and you'll need to be careful about how much time you spend close to it, because much like Icarus, you'll get burned. The latter is like any other level involving an enemy fleet, but it has some unique twists that can make navigation challenging and rewarding. This choice is fascinating because you can avoid Solar entirely, and still end up along the hard route if you know where Sector X's warp is. If you figure out that you can take the left path here and blast open all of these gates, you'll be able to enter a wormhole that sends you straight to Sector Z. Yes, Z, I am Canadian. An all-range level that has you defending the Great Fox from a series of missiles. It's tough, but it tests you on your ability to keep track of single targets in all-range mode, and some may prefer this kind of challenge to Macbeth's Landmaster shenanigans. Macbeth is cool because you have two ways of defeating the area boss, either shooting down the boss directly, or rerouting the runaway train so that it crashes in an entirely separate depot, the latter of which sends you to Area 6 and locks you into the fight with Andross's true form and the rematch with Starwolf. And, if you came from Zonus, Cat will fly in to help you here. That's the thing about Aquas. Even if you don't really like playing it, completing it will grant you perhaps this game's most brilliantly designed on-rails level, an onslaught of tough enemies and obstacles, micromanagement of objectives such as the searchlights and protecting Cat, and the boss, which is a bit more involved than just shooting the glowing spots when they appear, as you'll have to destroy the exhaust pipes, the parts that dispense barrels, avoid bombs, destroy the crane, and finally shoot the hell out of the body of the ship. If you destroy all of the searchlights, you head to the missile defense level Sector Z, and if not, you're off to Macbeth. Both a skill check and a player's choice, and this occurs a lot. Like I said, if you fail to defend Katina, you'll be downgraded to Sector X, but from there you can still get back on the hard route through a warp. Same goes for Meteo. If you end up there by mistake, you can warp to Katina and get back on track. God, I love this game. Okay, so I mentioned a ton of different possibilities there, and there are still more that I haven't mentioned, including my favorite variable, Slippy getting slapped by the boss in Sector X and knocked into Titania. The point of all this is that you get to discover Star Fox 64 however you like, and as you play through it again, you get to choose how difficult you want the game to be, and you get to create the route you have the most fun with. Complementing this structure is the fact that the game and its levels are so much fun to go through. When determining any particular route, you can decide if you want to pilot a submarine, or take a warp from the easy route to skip Aquas and Zonus, or you can do the pure hard route through the game's most difficult levels. Or you can take all sorts of crazy routes in an effort to obtain as many medals as possible and unlock bonus content in the game's multiplayer mode. Or simply just to challenge yourself because the game is really damn fun. My ideal route usually falls in line with the levels I find the most enjoyable, but not particularly difficult. Sometimes I do the pure hard route if I can survive long enough to stay on it, but I like staying on the normal route and getting to Area 6 through Macbeth. Since you can only get to Zone S through Aquas, sometimes I give that level a try. Whatever I'm feeling like doing at the moment. As long as I can make it to the hard version of Venom, I'm all good. And even if you can't quite make it there, the easy version of Venom still puts up one hell of a fight. Easily the hardest level to fly through, what with all the obstacles and enemies that require quick reaction time. It builds on the original Star Fox's version of Venom quite well. There are many ways to play this game, and it's up to you to discover them. That is brilliant, and to this day, Star Fox 64 remains unrivaled. All of these variables make Star Fox 64 immensely replayable, and because each playthrough isn't very long, losing all of your lives to some of the tougher challenges when taking the hard route isn't the end of the world, because you can always try another route and you'll get better at the game. It's a game where a live system actually has purpose, and it encourages you to improve, much like the original game. On top of this, the game strikes a perfect balance between its multiple gameplay modes. Corneria's initial introduction to all-range mode is way more effective than it would have been in Star Fox 2, as it first allows you to acclimate to the controls in the game's primary rail shooter context. Once it opens things up, it's a much more natural shift in perspective, and all of the same moves you've been using apply in 360-degree movement. Its boss also mostly stays in one place, making it even easier to refocus as you fly around it. If you continue to pursue the easy route, you'll end up fighting Starwolf, who are a bit more difficult to keep track of. As mentioned, it's important to practice aiming rapid-fire shots at your opponents so that they can't barrel roll out of everything you throw at them. But I also find it to be extremely important to brake and tilt your ship in the direction you want to turn, as you turn much faster and can keep track of the whole map at any given moment. It's also important to somersault when you have someone on your tail, as well as helping your wingmen out. If you don't have your wingmen in these fights, you're at a serious disadvantage. The cool thing about this fight in particular is that it's on a time limit. After the bomb is set, Starwolf attempts to distract you from the bomb, and if you take too long fighting them, the bomb will detonate and you'll be forced onto a different route. Again, the game rewards you for performing well. Unlike Star Fox 2, all-range mode is not the focus, but rather an extension of the core gameplay that shifts to introduce variety, depth, and challenge at specific points. while also being an essential mode to master if you want to clear Venom's hard route. The submarine and landmaster levels are also an extension of the core R-Wing gameplay, unlike the Walker in Star Fox 2, which imposed a drastically different gameplay style, perspective, and control scheme. While the landmaster may be landlocked, you can still hover over obstacles, boost, brake, and dodge whenever necessary. These vehicles carry both their own advantages and disadvantages, but they never stray from the on-rails gameplay. After all is said and done, Hard Venom does not pull any punches, primarily due to the battle with Starwolf. If you still don't have a grasp on all-range mode, this level will claim your runs time and time again. You also simply cannot fire charge shots at them in this mode, so you need to have mastered the art of free aim, and you'd better hope you manage to hang on to those twin blasters without losing a wing. Otherwise, you might not be able to deal enough damage to Starwolf at all. You also need to ensure that you have as many of your wingmen as you can to back you up, as you really don't want 2 or 3 members of Starwolf chasing you at once. Just remember your brake turning, and aim those rapid fire shots after giving an enemy the slip, and you should be able to come out of this fight alive. Andross will attempt to talk down to you as you approach him, but you've come this far, nothing's gonna stop you here. When it comes to Star Fox boss design, I always consider a boss well done when it focuses on unique ways of making shooting weak points difficult. Medio has the ship with the rotating part on its body, the electricity cannon, and the surprise second phase. Area 6 has the boss with the tentacles that must be disassembled while you dodge its attacks. Usually the bosses are all about how you can slowly work your way into its core. Andross is a giant floating head with hands, and for some reason he really likes to present the weak points on his palms to you. In comparison to the mechanical bosses of previous levels, this has always been hilarious to me, and it perpetuates the Nintendo hand boss stereotype that you'll see across Zelda, Mario, and multiple other franchises. The only question I never asked myself was, why? Why does Nintendo use bosses like this when designing a game? Well, it's because they only really have to program collision for the hands themselves, and they can very clearly communicate a weak point. But that's not the only way you can interact with Andross. Since Andross only reveals his weak points when his palms are open and facing you, you can shoot his eyes to make him expose one of his hands. In addition, while Andross is trying to inhale you and you're flying out of the way, you might think about using a projectile of some kind to fight back, rather than simply waiting for him to stop. In a good Star Fox boss fight, you never want to be waiting or going through the motions over and over again. You always want to be actively doing something, whether that means scanning for a weak point or dodging some tough enemy fire. That's why Andross is pretty much always vulnerable should you know where to attack him. In this case, the projectile in question is a bomb, the very thing you've been using throughout the game to take down groups of enemies and deal damage quickly. If you took the hard route to Venom, however, this is only his first phase. This phase can be reached no matter where you find yourself traveling across the Lylat system. Andross's true form, on the other hand, is just a pair of eyeballs and a giant brain. Only he has the brains to rule the Lylat system after all, and seeing this makes it a fairly compelling argument. The objective here is to fly around in all-range mode and avoid getting caught up in the stems beneath the brain. Eyeballs will also fly around the arena in an attempt to trip you up as you circle his brain. The only weak point is the green spot on the back of the brain, and he doesn't make it easy to hit. If it wasn't for Starwolf, I'd say this is probably the hardest all-range mode fight to keep track of, and that is totally fair for this point in the game. But once you manage to beat him, Andross will attempt to blow both you and him up at the same time, upon which Fox will let out a funny scream. But then...
Don't ever give up, my son.
Father?
James encourages his son as the two of them race out of there. Whether or not Fox was simply seeing things is left ambiguous, and it's a fantastic moment that still gets to me. One playthrough of Star Fox 64 is never enough. I come back to this game frequently, even today. Sometimes I just have the urge to play a good rail shooter, and thanks to the possibilities at play in Star Fox 64, I know I'm always in for a good time. Whether you decide to collect all of the medals to unlock more features in the multiplayer mode, or just have fun with a challenging playthrough, it really doesn't get much better than this. Even if I'm just playing the all-range dogfighting mode with my friends, Star Fox 64 is a comforting game that I know will always have my back, much like my wingmen Falco, Peppy, and Slippy. And nowhere else is that comfort symbolized than in the ambient piece that plays at the main menu, and whenever you finish a run. This track is so peaceful, only using a single ethereal synth and a low, pulsing accompaniment to sell the vastness of space, and it now stands as a representation of my attachment to this series. Like Star Fox 64 itself, I can always come back to this piece when I need to relax. Though these games normally take you on adventures through the solar system, I find this piece grounds me. This game is always fueled by action and reflexes, but this piece is soothing and truly beautiful. This is the kind of video game music that encapsulates all of my memories with a game through sound. I think of Falco's backhanded assistance and compliments, I think of Peppy's wisdom and helpful advice, and I think of Slippy, well, fighting for his life in Titania. I think of the times I earned my way through the hard routes, and the times I finally managed to beat Starwolf after they kicked my ass for so long. This piece brings it all to the front of my mind, and I will forever cherish it, as well as the memories I made with this game.
Good luck.
From here, Star Fox went quiet for a while. Star Fox 64 sold incredibly well for its time, over 4 million copies in fact, outselling Banjo-Kazooie and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. That is no small feat, considering the strong following Banjo-Kazooie has today, and the respect Majora's Mask has accrued since its release. It seemed easy to come to the conclusion that Star Fox had a lot of potential as a franchise, right? If Star Fox 64 were to see a proper follow-up, I'd want it to maintain that freeform structure it has, using dynamic difficulty by sending players to different levels, as well as incorporating branching storylines depending on the routes you take. I'd love it if they were to capitalize on the excitement I felt when Kat returned to help me in Sector Z, or when Starwolf demanded a rematch in Hard Venom, or when I went to save Slippy in Titania. These are cool narrative moments driven by that dynamic difficulty, the kind of unique storytelling that makes video games such an awesome medium in the first place. But Star Fox never really attempted this again. At least, not without caveats. Miyamoto's statement that Star Fox was considered a platform for testing new ideas would lead to it being a wildly inconsistent franchise. Let's go through each of the games that came after Star Fox 64 and what we could learn from them, good and bad. The game to immediately follow Star Fox 64 wasn't even a rail shooter, or a shooter of any kind. It was an action-adventure game that was never intended to be related to Star Fox at all, and this occurred for a couple of reasons. First of all, Takeya Imamura wanted to produce a sequel to Star Fox 64 and asked Miyamoto about it. Miyamoto gave him permission, but asked that it be an action-adventure game instead. Yeah. The team, most likely perplexed by this decision, began conceptualizing ideas for this strange project. But with the GameCube's release being imminent and Mario and Zelda requiring the company's full attention, the project didn't gain momentum and was shelved. Meanwhile, Rare was working away on what would have been their final Nintendo 64 game, Dinosaur Planet. The game was designed to take advantage of the console's memory expansion pack, as well as a 64 megabyte cartridge, the largest size on that system. The game was ambitious in scope, drawing inspiration from Ocarina of Time in design, and it aimed to bring a massive, detailed prehistoric world to life, something that seems nigh impossible on that hardware. It would have also let you play as two protagonists, Saber and Crystal, with their narratives interconnecting at certain points. You'd use the Swap Stone to switch to them, which became the Warp Stone in the final game. I have to wonder what that original storyline was like, as it seemed like both characters had their own strengths, weaknesses, and philosophies. The team prepared a demonstration for E3 2000, but just before the show, Rare was asked by Nintendo to not discuss the game much at all. This is because Miyamoto noticed the similarities between Saber and Fox McCloud, and Nintendo met with Rare to talk about merging the Star Fox IP with Dinosaur Planet. The game's development targeted the GameCube, and eventually, Dinosaur Planet was dropped from the title entirely. If you ask me, this was a frustratingly stupid decision and ultimately led to this game feeling like some sort of side quest in the established Star Fox canon. I mean, Rare built this world to be something of its own, and then they had to insert Fox McCloud into it. Crystal was almost scrapped, but Imamura reworked her to be included in the game in some capacity, even though Fox and Crystal could have very easily worked off of one another's accomplishments, as Saber and Crystal did in the original version of the game. In the final game, Crystal is playable in the prologue before becoming a damsel in distress, a prize for Fox McCloud and the player after completing the game. Her sexually provocative design was the result of Miyamoto and Imamura wanting to introduce more mature elements in the series, which is certainly a choice. I mean, Star Fox 64's backstory is definitely ripe for exploration, as it poses a ton of fascinating questions. Why did Pigma betray his team to Andross? And why does it seem like he's lost his mind since? How did James's death impact Peppy? Why is Wolf a hired gun for Andross, and what does he truly want? That is the kind of maturity I'd love to see come out of the Star Fox canon. Ironically, this decision feels like it was made by a horny teenager, rather than a talented artist like Imamura. I love his work so much, but this was not it, man. To clarify, I have nothing against sexuality being a core attribute for a character in a video game. One of my favorite action games of all time is Bayonetta, and the difference between her character and what happened to Crystal is that Bayonetta absolutely owns her sex appeal and flaunts it confidently, and demands attention and respect, kicking ass all the while. Crystal, on the other hand, went from a cute central protagonist to a sexualized prize for the character, which felt like a waste of potential. There's an important distinction to be made there. In the end, Crystal absolutely could have stayed in the game as a second protagonist to Fox, as she is well informed on the planet, observably physically capable, and it would have created both unique gameplay scenarios and easy banter between the two of them. They also made the decision to switch the primary language of the non-Star Fox characters to this cheesy fake language, a change that I to this day do not understand.
Kia Gechki Okrozoa Palace! Kia Judge Dekelu! Edu Su Tavuk! General Scales!
When it comes to the game's relationship with Star Fox in terms of gameplay, it has little to no impact on the series' core design. There are segments where you fly an R-Wing in between planets, but that's it. Also, the final boss is a cop-out. You think you're going up against General Scales, but then Falco swoops in after being absent from the entire game, and you fight Andross in what is essentially the same exact boss from Star Fox 64. So there's not much here that contributes to the discussion of the Star Fox series. But I have a lot to say about it as an action-adventure game. So why don't we talk about that for a second? Full disclosure, I don't really like this game. I am a huge fan of Zelda's core design, and I feel that leads me to put games adjacent to the series under more scrutiny. I think it's excruciatingly boring a lot of the time, but I also want to be constructive in my arguments, so here's how I feel about it. For one thing, the core problem solving in Star Fox Adventures does not interest me. There are good puzzles in the game, particularly involving your cooperation with Tricky the Dinosaur, like when you have to raise him up here and have him breathe fire to open a path. And I remember the walled city being pretty cool, but I find most of it to be painfully elementary. There are a staggering amount of puzzles that follow a similar dull theme, like the amount of puzzles that have you escorting a barrel from one place to the next, or pushing blocks or aiming at things. Even when they attempt to freshen things up through different obstacles and terrain, this is not a very interesting premise to base a series of puzzles on, as it has little to do with the core of the game itself, that being the staff. As you progress through the game, the staff upgrades you find enable you to shoot different projectiles, jump to new places, and give you an edge in combat. The problem is that I find most of the challenges involving the staff boil down to you aiming at a specific thing, or using abilities when they are very obviously conveyed to you. What they don't consider is the theory behind each item or upgrade, the how and why items should be used, nor do they play with their applications much outside of their initial defining characteristics. The core of a Zelda game is finding unique applications for each new item you obtain, and how they can be used to look differently at the problems you've been faced with. Star Fox Adventures' items and upgrades are either entirely situational, or used in a pretty uninspired manner. To further accentuate this issue, I found the dungeons to lack theming in terms of design. Aesthetically, I think Star Fox Adventures looks gorgeous. The atmosphere surrounding this game's world was expertly crafted, and the dungeons are no exception. But in terms of gameplay, they left a lot to be desired. For example, I thought Cloud Runner Fortress was going to be stealth-oriented, and while that is partially true, the stealth in this game boils down to you putting on the disguise and walking past everything in sight. If you put the disguise on while an enemy is looking at you, they'll walk towards you perpetually and won't stop until you take it off. They won't even attack you, they'll just keep walking. I just didn't feel like these dungeons were centered around a compelling enough idea, unlike something like Ocarina of Time, which had you rescue Gorons in the Fire Temple in a semi-non-linear fashion, or the Lens of Truth and Hover Boots in the Shadow Temple that allow you to go beyond what you see with just your eyes. I don't feel that puzzles with the level of ingenuity seen in Zelda are ever truly present in Star Fox Adventures. Like, in Ocean Force Point, I recall there being a sort of memory game where you had to step on the right spaces in order to proceed, but if you ever get stuck, all you have to do is turn around and look at the map on the wall. Why is this even here? It feels like such a time waster, rather than an introduction to a new exciting concept or a test of general game sense. On top of this, the game is pathetically easy. Most combat scenarios boil down to you mashing the A button on groups of Sharkclaw. You can vary your combos somewhat, but there's not much of a need to as long as the enemies die. Now, simplistic combat wouldn't be much of a problem if the game compensated for it with challenging enemy patterns or punishing damage values, but the enemy patterns are usually easy to predict, and they barely do any damage at all. This only scrapes the surface of the issue, however. Throughout the game, you can find these things, which revive you in the exact same spot that you died, with full health, should you choose to use one. While you can normally only carry one of them at a time, you can very quickly and easily purchase a large bag for them that allow you to carry up to 10. This means that you could theoretically die 10 times in a row without any repercussions whatsoever, and considering the game is easy enough on its own, by purchasing these things, you can become unstoppable. The thing I took issue with most of all, though, was the game's world structure. The upgrades necessary for completing the game, or for the sake of strengthening Fox, are either along the path for progression, or located in the game's one and only store. Star Fox Adventures paths all expand outward in straight lines from Thorntail Hollow, with some of them being further along paths that you'll have already walked through. The problem is that the only shop and warp point in the entire game is in that hub, meaning that a large chunk of the game, after you've slowly walked toward a new area, is walking back and forth between Thorntail Hollow and your next objective. If you ever need items, you're walking back to Thorntail Hollow. If you need to go to Krazoa Palace again to retrieve a new upgrade, you're walking back to Thorntail Hollow. If you need to take a path to another area in the game world, you'll still have to cross back through Thorntail Hollow. Along these paths are virtually nothing aside from scarabs, the game's currency. No heart pieces, treasure charts, empty bottles, or anything like that. There might be an optional item here and there, but for the most part, it's practically a wasteland. This is partially because most of the areas between major locales are loading zones. They exist solely to load other parts of the game, as the switch to a disc-based console necessitated their existence. This is common in games with seamless gameplay, but it's sadly more egregious here because of both the world structure and the lack of purpose in a lot of the corridors you'll end up walking through. There's a puzzle where you have to alter the water level in order to get back to Thorntail Hollow. It's not particularly exciting, but because of the layout of the world, you'll likely be doing this puzzle quite a few more times. It's very much a filler section. When you combine this linear, empty world layout with the other core issues that plagued Star Fox Adventures for me, you have a game that I ultimately thought was pretty miserable to experience. Some of you that have been watching for a long time, and I mean a long time, like when I had 1,000 subscribers, might remember that I covered the Star Fox series in one of my earliest series retrospectives. Those videos are private today. I hate them. They attempted to be a blend of both humor and serious critique, but I felt that they came off as mean-spirited and needlessly cynical. A far cry from anything I would make now, which makes sense because I was still pretty much a kid at the time. I just graduated high school. The Star Fox Adventures video made it sound like the game tried to kill me or something, which was played up for comedic purposes, of course, but I really came across as a whining teenager in that video. These days, even with games I dislike, I try to be a little more nuanced and see other perspectives, but I still make mistakes. Don't worry, I read your comments. I know I was unfair to Mario Kart Tour and the Link's Awakening remake. The latter, I think, is a great remake, but I personally prefer the original. I think I was just projecting my desire for an original 2D Zelda game as disdain for a remake of a game about dreams being something you have to wake up from, which is not fair to the remake itself. What I'm getting at here is that people need to be more nuanced in their discussion of games, and this is especially relevant to Star Fox, as we'll soon see. The division I see on social media over games in particular is sad. Civility as a notion has been left firmly at the door. For example, depending on who you ask, Breath of the Wild is either a compelling nonlinear sandbox or an empty, bland open-world game that wishes it could be what Zelda used to be. And both sides often never seek out opposing arguments because they are so damn hostile. Simply put, I would not have made my Zelda videos in any capacity had I not heard what other Zelda fans have had to say over the years. I mean, my favorite game of all time is The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, and my video on that game has a whole chapter dedicated to the things I felt it messed up on, and how those missteps inspire me to create something of my own someday. In all honesty, I feel that learning from the mistakes your favorite games make, and building something entirely new from the desire to improve them, is equally, if not more important, than just trying to recreate the things you enjoy. Let me give you an example. I played Beyond Good and Evil for the first time recently, and while I thought it was an awesome game, I felt it could have used some more work. To directly contrast some of its strong aspects against Star Fox Adventures for a moment, its combat, while simple, is more punishing than that game in terms of damage, and the patterns are a bit trickier to keep track of when you're being swarmed by a bunch of enemies at once. The major areas you explore have much tighter, more puzzling level design built around Jade's own abilities, their own central themes such as electricity or environmental puzzles, and how your companion factors into each challenge you come across. The world is much smaller than Star Fox Adventures' world, but it is much denser and packed with things to find, including the primary collectible for progression, pearls. All the while, you can take photos of the organic life you stumble across and make money while doing it, funding your purchase of pearls, health upgrades, and more. The world building at play with the Alpha Section's totalitarian control of Hillis, and how the game demonstrates its impact on Hillis, is beautiful. It's a brilliantly crafted game, but even it left me wanting more. I felt there could have been more dungeons to explore and more items to find that changed gameplay at its core, much like the dungeon items in Zelda, and the stealth was god-awful. No thank you. The overworld map may have been packed with things to find, but I felt like it could have used a couple more major locations to give the world more life. Most of all, however, is that the narrative doesn't really ever touch upon the game's namesake, the notion of morality lying beyond black and white concepts such as good or evil. Though I won't spoil how the game ends. I figured that after Paige was kidnapped and they built up Double H as this reliable companion, you would have to choose between them or something. Either way, the story in place is still affecting when it needs to be, but it doesn't run as deep as you might think. These disagreements I have with how the game turned out might be fun to discuss with the game's director. Apparently the game was reworked during development after Michel Ancel played Wind Waker, because he felt that the game had too much exploration. I consider that to be my favorite aspect of the game, and it just goes to show how different opinions can produce wildly different works, whereas both of them have their own merits. What is the point of all of this? Well, it's to demonstrate that nothing in discussion of art is black and white. You might perceive it as such, but really it boils down to determining the intent behind the artists that create them, and whether or not you agree with it. I bring this up because it directly ties into the future of the Star Fox series, starting with Star Fox Assault. As soon as you start the game, it hits you with two absolutely phenomenal pieces of music. One being a full orchestral arrangement of the main Star Fox theme, backed by techno percussion that works really well. The main menu kicks that latter instrumentation into high gear, while still maintaining the initial gut punch of a live orchestra in a Star Fox game. This game's soundtrack will have you entranced throughout the game, from the heartfelt arrangement of Star Fox 64's take on Corneria Under Attack, to the trumpet carrying the iconic Star Wolf battle theme. This soundtrack never misses, and it remains my favorite soundtrack in the series. It took the catchy melodies that Koji Kondo and Hajime Wakai introduced in 64 and gave them life, the likes of which I'd only heard in Smash Bros. Prior to this game. It kicks ass. The basic premise of Star Fox Assault is that Andross's nephew Oikini is leading a rebellion against the Cornerian army, until suddenly he is defeated by an Aporoid, an alien species that mutates and corrupts its host. This becomes the main villain the Star Fox crew must combat. Tonally, the game is consistent with Star Fox 64's dialogue, and it can be pretty funny. It has what I think is Slippy's funniest line in the entire series.
Falco, Slippy, the airborne enemies are all yours.
Gotcha. Try not to make a mess of things, Slippy.
Give it a rest, Falco. Seriously. Shut your beak for once.
Most of the voice acting in this game sounds great, though I do prefer Mike West and Rick May as Fox and Peppy respectively. Everyone is enjoyable to listen to. Crystal replacing Peppy as a member of the core Star Fox team while he oversees each mission was a solid choice as well, as it gave her a chance to become more of a character after accidentally becoming a part of the Star Fox canon in Adventures. Plus, it lets Peppy relax a bit in his old age. I don't think Crystal does a whole lot in this game aside from being a love interest for Fox, but it does lead to some pretty fun moments.
Okay, let's move. Crystal and I will head down to the surface. Falco and Slippy, the skies are yours.
A mission together at last.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'll take care of things here, so you two can come back on your honeymoon.
What are you, nuts? We're not yet,
Not yet.
Unlike Star Fox 64, Star Fox Assault doesn't feature any branching pathways for you to find. It's just 10 missions with 3 separate difficulties that alter how many enemies appear. While I find this disappointing, it's clear that they designed the game this way with intent. The game is meant to build on its core focus over the course of those 10 missions, and tell its story in a specific way. That focus being the balance between R-Wing, Landmaster, and on-foot sections. It starts you off with a classic on-rails R-Wing level, and it's great fun. Seeing as this game was developed by Namco and they are well known for their arcade shooters, to the point where their influence is quite evident in how enemies approach you, it all makes sense. All of the rail shooter levels are well done, and easily my favorite part of the campaign. You've got great enemy formations and obstacles to deal with, and the bosses take from what Star Fox 64 did well. I also enjoyed the all-range mission where you have to defend the orbital gate from missiles, much like Sector Z in Star Fox 64. It's just a shame that there are so few levels that focus exclusively on these things. Of the 10 missions in this game, only 3 of them feature any rail shooter action. The first level eases you in with the action typical of this gameplay style, followed by a fight with Oikini that is intentionally similar to the Andross fight. Falco even mentions this outright. Treating this fight as a hand warmer was definitely a great way to get players into the swing of things, as from here it's all about killing Aporoids. Katina is where things get controversial. You begin the level on foot. This actually isn't the first time you've been able to control characters outside of a vehicle in a Star Fox game, as in the multiplayer for 64, you could unlock on-foot multiplayer if you first earned every medal, and then earned a medal in Venom on Expert difficulty. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't know this was a thing. It's also cool to see them attempt this, as at this point, most people in popular culture know Fox and Falco more for their movesets in Smash Bros. Than they do Star Fox. There are 3 control schemes to choose from. The first controls like Metroid Prime, the second controls like your average twin-stick third-person shooter, and the third has you aim the character and move forward with the R button. I used the second control scheme, and I never had any problems, but I could understand why some would feel the controls are sloppy or imprecise. I would even go as far to say that I had fun playing as Fox outside of his vehicle. What with all of the weapons you can use and the utility they offer, as well as killing as many enemies as possible to obtain medals and stuff. You'll also have to swap to the Landmaster in some levels to both blow up certain walls and destroy certain vehicles, and in Katina's case, to fight the boss, as you'll need to hover on top of it and keep your balance as best you can while it tries to shake you. The big problem with the Landmaster is that you can't individually set the controls for it and the on-foot controls, leading to this dual-stick control scheme with the Landmaster that is just inferior to the regular controls. So you essentially have to pick your poison. Do you have decent on-foot controls and suffer through the Landmaster, or vice versa? I mean, I got used to them. I think they're fine, but I can understand the complaints here. While I had a good time with this gameplay for the most part, I also can understand why people might take issue with the structure at play here. Most of the missions in this game boil down to you taking down a certain number of targets before it pulls you out of the mission. When playing almost exclusively on foot, this game barely even resembles Star Fox. In levels like Corneria, for example, you're running around sniping a bunch of targets before you are locked into a turret section. Not an on-rails section where you still have the freedom and depth at play with the R-Wing, you are stationary on your wingman's plane, shooting at targets until the game decides you're done. The same thing happens in Ficina. In Sargasso's Space Zone, you're infiltrating a giant space station, exploring multiple stories and taking down all of the enemies, unless you have to worry about the might gauge, in which you need to jump all the way back down to your R-Wing and eliminate the enemies outside before your mission fails. This kind of gameplay is anything but what I would consider Star Fox. In addition, if you haven't acclimated to the on-foot controls yet, which is believable considering this is only the second level to use them, slipping off of bridges at a high point in the base could probably frustrate the hell out of you. I never had this happen to me, but I remember reading some reviews that mentioned this being a big problem, and seeing as a ton of people dislike the ground controls in this game, yeah, it's easy to see why this level might have been frustrating. At the very least, it ends with a strong fight with Starwolf. Starwolf actually comes to your aid in the defense against Corneria, as Andross is no longer paying them, and Wolf isn't about to let anyone other than him kill Fox. Now, when it comes to the might gauge, I do believe they had a really strong premise for a game with that mechanic. Let's take the level set on Sauria, which is the same planet you visit in Star Fox Adventures. The might gauge fills if you let too many enemies populate the skies. While you are wandering around the planet, looking for the targets you need to destroy, the might gauge is constantly filling, requiring you to locate your R-Wing and take to the skies so that your mission doesn't end right then and there. This balance is commendable, and it provided me with some of Star Fox Assault's most engaging gameplay. You know, aside from the on-rails R-Wing sections that are barely in the game. On top of that, I did get a kick out of revisiting this place. I may not enjoy Star Fox Adventures, but the detail and atmosphere were lovingly recreated here. You can even stumble upon the same room in which you get a staff upgrade in Adventures, and in here waiting for you are weapons and health replenishers. Pretty cool. I wish the might gauge was used more often as a mechanic, but it only appears here and in Sargasso. Encouraging this kind of frequent switching depending on the circumstance would not only allow for players to acclimate to each style far more, but it also makes the level challenging and at times a bit of a nail-biter. This should have been the framework for the entire game. You can still have the kind of variety that is all over this game without compromising that solid core foundation built from the might gauge, and players would have a better time adjusting to each vehicle as well. Throw some more rail shooter gameplay in there, and maybe scale back the amount of on-foot sections as well as tightening their controls, and you have something way more focused and something that stands on its own in the Star Fox series, rather than simply trying to follow in 64's footsteps. Perhaps the worst example of the on-foot sections, and the reason I can totally see why people dislike this game, is the Aperoid homeworld. The level is almost entirely played on foot, with the exception of the Landmaster here and there. Your objective is to infiltrate all of these bases with nothing but the guns you can find, and your ability to dodge and shoot, all on a single life bar. There are more enemies here than in any other on-foot section, and while the claustrophobia isn't as prevalent as it is in the Saurian caves, or in the bases on Katina and Ficina, it still makes the level feel incredibly oppressive. You can find health replenishers, but it's in your best interest to take as little damage as possible. Every time you die in this game, you are taken back to the beginning of the state the mission is in, So for example, if you've made it past an on-rails section and are now in all-range mode and you die there, you'll respawn in the all-range mode part. Because of the length of this on-foot section, dying at any point is painful and saps all motivation from you, as you now have to do all of the base infiltration you just did all over again. You can make it through a few bases by the skin of your teeth, only to die to some pea shooter that you weren't looking at and have to restart the whole thing. It's brutal, and perhaps the strongest argument against these sections that you could make. What on earth does any of this have to do with Star Fox's gameplay loop? Ironically, the section afterwards with the R-Wing is a lot simpler. Just shoot the things underneath the base and you're done. The final level actually returns to some good old-fashioned rail shooting, and it's awesome. It tests you on maneuverability and reflexes when dodging and shooting with all kinds of high-speed hazards, before taking you into an all-range boss fight where you have to disassemble the Queen Aperoid's armor and shoot its weak point. All the while, stuff is swarming around you. Finally, you take on the Queen's last form, wherein you have to gradually open it up to attacks by shooting these spots with your blasters, and then deal as much damage as possible. All while it is firing back at you without pause and your comrades are helping you out. Solid way to end the game, and an even more painful way of hammering in the lack of rail shooter gameplay in this game, because this was a ton of fun. If it wasn't already clear, Star Fox Assault's biggest problem is that it never truly settles on a core focus. It jumps around between multiple gameplay styles, and there is a strong imbalance between what Star Fox is best known for and a new gameplay style that doesn't gel with everyone, one that barely even resembles Star Fox. A lot of your enjoyment with this game hinges on how much you like those other gameplay styles. Like, let's take a look at each mission piece by piece. Fortuna, fully on-rails R-Wing action, nothing wrong here. Katina, primarily on foot followed by some Landmaster usage. Sargasso, almost exclusively on foot, only utilizing the R-Wing when you absolutely need to, and the fight with Starwolf. To be fair, Starwolf is an essential teaching tool for all-range mode, and it was wise to place them here, but a majority of the game so far has been on foot. Ficina, Landmaster followed by an on-foot section that ends whenever the game feels like it, followed by a turret section, and then an all-range mode R-Wing boss. Asteroid Belt, fully on rails again, finally. Sauria, using the R-Wing, Landmaster, and on-foot modes in unison. Corneria, sniping enemies on foot, followed by a turret section. Orbital Gate, all-range mode missile defense. Aperoid Homeworld, almost entirely on foot and relentlessly difficult, followed by a much simpler all-range R-Wing section. And then the final boss is on-rails, all-range mode, on rails. Holy hell, that's a lot of variety, and for some that makes for a great game. But if you don't gel with the on-foot controls or the Landmaster much, then you are not gonna like this game at all. It jumps around so often that it makes it difficult to fully appreciate any given style. Not to mention that most of the game feels more like Ratchet & Clank than it does Star Fox. That being said, I still think this game had the ingredients for a truly brilliant Star Fox game. Like I said, the might gauge would have made this balance a lot easier to stomach, not to mention more fun. But I generally enjoy the variety at play here. I know I seemed weary of it when describing it, but that's also because I was considering the other camp that doesn't really vibe with this game. I honestly think there is fun to be had here if you can adjust to its haphazard structure and controls. The experience is varied enough that it can be really exciting. While not as replayable as Star Fox 64, it isn't long, and replaying it takes a little under 3 hours, although it could take longer depending on if you're playing Gold difficulty. That said, it is still plagued by the notion that it doesn't settle on one thing. The reason why this game might feel unfocused is because the single-player campaign was almost entirely an afterthought. When the game was first revealed at E3 2003, it focused primarily on multiplayer battles, as Imamura wanted to build on the multiplayer scene in Star Fox 64. The team apparently seriously considered making the game exclusively multiplayer, but they eventually decided to create a campaign, which explains the game being delayed all the way to 2005. I can't even imagine how that would have gone over, man. Also, these early builds look rough as hell. The final game looks way better. Either way, the multiplayer in this game is awesome, and it shows that this was what development centered on for a while. I genuinely consider the multiplayer to be superior to the campaign. There's something so thrilling about grabbing a rocket launcher, jumping in an R-wing, and then standing on its wing as it flies forward while you shoot rockets at people on the ground. The blend of multiple gameplay styles works incredibly well for death matches, as you need to be resourceful and choose when to stay airborne, or find a landmaster, or even stay on foot and use weapons to take down players and vehicles. This blend of vehicles and gameplay styles were very obviously built for multiplayer, and the maps, which are nearly identical to their appearances in the campaign, also feel multiplayer driven by design. What with all of the places you can hide out in Saria, or Ficina's central base where you can find a ton of different weapons, but is a hotspot for close quarters combat. This all explains the non-linear structure in the campaign, where you have to go explore the map and kill a bunch of enemies before you can move on. It also explains why there are so few rail shooter levels. They were designed after all of the multiplayer maps. Therefore, the existing arena-like maps were easier to design single-player levels around. The multiplayer recontextualizes a lot of the campaign's design and structure. There are even maps in the multiplayer of planets that never even appeared in the campaign, like Titania and Zones. Each character has their own stat differences, giving them specific advantages depending on the map and game type, which is why the game has you set the mode, rules, and map first before any of you pick a character. You can play Deathmatch, Team Deathmatch, a sort of take on Oddball from Halo, as well as wild game types like this jetpack and rocket launcher mode. At this point, the game is no longer Star Fox, it's Halo. This is a Halo game mode. I'm being completely honest when I say that if the multiplayer had more game types, like Capture the Flag, King of the Hill, and whatnot, and it had proper online multiplayer for up to 8 players at the very least, I think this would have been one of the greatest multiplayer games on the GameCube. To be honest, it already kind of is, but if it had a little more, I think this game would have been in constant rotation on game nights, and it still has a unique feel to this day. Watch this. I'm standing on my teammate's R-Wing. He flips me into the air, I kill someone on the ground with a rocket launcher, and then he catches me on his R-Wing as I'm falling back down. Okay, I may have staged this clip for the video, but this is absolutely a thing you could attempt in a real match. Get some friends over or hop on netplay and try out this game's multiplayer. The only real problem with it is that you have to play a ton of multiplayer matches to unlock everything. I'm talking about a couple of 100 matches. So if you're playing on Dolphin or a modded console, enable some action replay codes, and while you're at it, enable this option in the graphics configuration so that netplay doesn't lag horribly when you look at the sun. You're welcome. Star Fox Assault had a lot of ideas that I think could have moved the series in an exciting direction. I enjoyed it for the most part, but it's clear to see why it didn't captivate everyone. The single player honestly takes a huge backseat to what the game was originally intended to be. That said, I could totally see how this would be someone's favorite Star Fox game. I do genuinely feel like there's a lot to love here. A year and a half later came Star Fox Command for the Nintendo DS, which returned the IP to series programmer Dylan Cuthbert, who took on the role of game director, and you can truly feel his influence on the game. Command utilizes ideas from Star Fox 2, primarily the real-time strategy structure. On any given level, you draw a path for each unit you want to move, and after you end your turn, your units will move along that path while the enemies pursue the Great Fox. If a single unit touches the Great Fox, or you run out of turns, the mission will end. So it's in your best interest to take down enemies as efficiently as you can. Additionally, across all of the battles is a timer that ticks down when you're in battle. When it reaches 0, the enemies will advance on the Great Fox. You can find time extenders and other pickups on the maps themselves, in thick fog or from destroying enemy bases. Much like Star Fox 2, you will enter battle with other units once you collide with them, in an all-range battle where you need to take down all of the targets. Each character has their own abilities. Fox has what you'd expect, while Falco can lock onto multiple targets at once like in Panzer Dragoon. Slippy can't lock on, but he can fire strong rapid-fire shots. The game also rewards you for aiming a charge shot at an enemy for long periods of time by stacking the damage you can deal to a single target, which is a really satisfying mechanic and something I used often. Each character can also barrel roll for a long-ass time, deflecting anything that is fired at them, and you can use this in order to destroy enemy bases as you charge through these squares. Super satisfying. You can also find health and other power-ups in these battles, introducing risk and reward into each scenario. and because of the time limit, your skill and efficiency in dealing with enemies will benefit you greatly, in addition to good strategy on the map. All of this is to say that Star Fox Command is a significantly more fleshed out strategy game than Star Fox 2. I find that the units you are given through your choices in the campaign, as well as the maps themselves, inject some variety and depth into each mission. I enjoy deciding what unit I feel I could perform well with on any given challenge. Sometimes the layout will be a little more involved and require planning and strategic adjustment in order to get the job done. It even has online multiplayer. Well, it had online multiplayer anyway. I have a couple of reasons why I don't particularly love this game, though. For starters, the whole gameplay loop of shooting specific targets over and over again basically never changes. You will certainly fight bosses that feel more akin to all range mode battles in Star Fox 64 or Assault, as you have to disassemble them and find their weak points, as well as chase down Starwolf depending on your route. But the truth is, you've seen most of this game within the first 2 maps or so. There really aren't any on-rails missions either, aside from these brief chase sequences here. I don't get it! What is with this strange aversion to rail shooter gameplay? Isn't that what Star Fox's foundation was built on? Isn't that the very thing that made Star Fox 64 what it was? Surely it deserves to be attempted more. That's the other thing though. Star Fox Command is structurally so far removed from anything else in the series, aside from Star Fox 2, which was only released many, many years after its initial cancellation. This game is emblematic of that philosophy Miyamoto had for Star Fox as an experimental testing ground for new ideas, because it is entirely its own thing. It's well made for sure, but repetitive and not at all what you might be looking for if you're coming off of Star Fox 64, or even Assault. But it isn't a bad game for that. For what it is, it's quite good. It's just not for me. That said, if experimentation truly was Star Fox's trajectory for the foreseeable future, then at least it received a creative blend of real-time strategy and action. Even if I were to enjoy playing this game more, the control scheme gives me serious hand cramps if I play it for too long. Like Metroid Prime Hunters or Kid Icarus Uprising, you hold the DS in your non-dominant hand and the stylus in your dominant one. You shoot with one of the shoulder or face buttons, while every other command is performed via the touchscreen. Barrel rolls mean drawing circles, aiming is done entirely with the stylus's position on the screen, and you can perform somersaults and U-turns with the buttons on the sides of the map. While this control scheme does afford you great accuracy when shooting, it does begin to wear on my hands and wrists after a while. It's definitely a game that deserves a keyboard and mouse patch. The DS as a portable console was the right choice for this kind of game. The portability means you can pop the game in, do a mission, and close the DS while you're out and about. That repetition doesn't necessarily set in if you're playing it on the go, but if you're playing it like you would any other video game on a home console, you'll no doubt start to feel both the hand cramps and the sameness in objectives across each battle. Perhaps the game's most entertaining aspect are its numerous routes through the story. This game features 9 different endings, and your route can change drastically at any given time, depending on the decisions you make. The best part? The things that can happen in this game are hilarious. The entire game's premise is predicated on Fox getting the gang back together to defend the Lilat system once more. Falco lives as a loner, while Slippy ends up falling in love and going his own way. Good for him. Apparently Crystal was pushed out of the Star Fox team by Fox, because as they grew closer, he couldn't bear the thought of Crystal being put in harm's way any longer. This melodrama only gets wilder. As you proceed through the game and make choices, various different meetings can occur, and all of the characters will speak through garbled recordings of your own voice, should you choose to record for them in the options menu. Anyway, let's talk about the endings. The first one you see seems to end on a peaceful note, but then Crystal runs off to be with Starwolf, leaving Fox a sobbing mess. After this, you obtain the Key of Destiny, which lets you take any path you want. Yeah, so you need to beat the game once in order to do any of this fun, choice-driven stuff. In one of the other endings, Crystal betrays the Star Fox team after her and Fox's relationship grows strained, and she joins Starwolf. The pressure of being in Starwolf becomes too much to bear as she is mocked by the townspeople, and she becomes a lone bounty hunter by the name of Cursed. Yeah. In Pigma's Revenge, Falco becomes lost as the rest of Star Fox save the Lilat system. But then Cat calls upon him to form Star Falco. Why not? Perhaps the most wholesome ending sees Fox and Crystal reconcile and live happily ever after. The two become parents. Fox dons his father's shades, and their son Marcus looks like he's tweaking. Later on, Marcus forms a new version of Star Fox, including Peppy's granddaughter, Slippy's son, and... oh man, he's still here! Oh, poor Falco. The funniest ending for me is the Curse of Pigma ending. Much like some of the other endings, Crystal remains with Starwolf thanks to Fox's selfishness. This sends Fox into an intense depression. He drinks his sorrows away. Falco tries to help his old friend, but his words fall on deaf ears. The game actually utters the line, "Fox lived as one already dead, barely eating or sleeping." So what does Falco do to cheer him up? They form the G0 Grand Prix. What the hell is this game, man? Honestly, if all of these endings didn't already exist on YouTube, this kind of stuff would actually compel me to play through the game multiple times. I'll let you decide whether or not that sounds worthwhile, because it all hinges on how much you enjoy the game. Either way, it was clear that this was meant to be the end-all for the Star Fox canon. There are so many outcomes here, and I'm glad future Star Fox games didn't try to invalidate them by choosing one as the canon ending. I mean, I'm out here hoping that the G0 Grand Prix is canon. Don't take that from me. This would end up being the last original Star Fox game for 10 years. Its sales weren't great, and it seemed as though the series would be put on hold for a long time.
Good luck.
Behind closed doors, a small team had experimented with Star Fox on the Wii, but none of their ideas seemed to bear fruit. Only with the Wii U's capabilities did Miyamoto come up with something worthwhile, at least according to him. The game was first announced in 2014, and I could not wait to get my hands on it. The game enlisted the help of Platinum Games after both their elaborate R-Wing Easter egg in Bayonetta 2, and no doubt because of their reputation in the action genre. Bayonetta 2 is an absolute masterpiece, and it only gets better the more you play it, and the more you master your combos and alternate weapons. Much like the rest of Platinum's games, your first playthrough is merely a chance to acclimate to the game and appreciate its beauty. Every subsequent run is where the depth truly comes out to play, and Bayonetta 2 is all that and more. With both replayability and a solid grasp on action in mind, it seems like a no-brainer that Platinum would be able to do great work with Nintendo on Star Fox. It's no secret that the Wii U's final year or two were horrible, but Star Fox was looking like it would be able to fill a pretty large drought in major releases. Instead, it performed poorly, and today it remains the most divisive game in the entire Star Fox series. Its control scheme polarized people, but my biggest question about Star Fox Zero goes beyond whether or not the controls work for me. But before I can ask that question, I should talk about my personal experience with the game, what I think the controls added to and detracted from that experience, and why I think people were turned off by them. The major hook of this game is the R-Wing's control scheme. It does everything you'd expect it to, and you can boost and brake with the right stick, as well as somersault and U-turn, but thanks to the Wii U gamepad, you can aim independently of the direction you're flying. While your reticle will turn with your ship as it would in any other Star Fox game, this gives you way more freedom to both move and hole up in one area of the screen while shooting at everything that comes your way. Much like Splatoon, you can recenter the reticle by pressing the Y button, which I highly recommend you do frequently so that you don't get disoriented. I personally love the utility that this offers the R-Wing in both on-rails levels and all-range mode. I actually found this separation between ship and reticle to be beneficial in the fights with Starwolf, which historically have been the biggest skill checks when it comes to all-range mode. I love being rewarded for my aim in these fights as I watch their health just slip away from rapid-fire shots. Where moving and shooting independently becomes extremely important is in boss fights that have you taking down massive structures bit by bit, such as taking down cannons or other weak points. For these, you'll need to lock onto the boss on one screen and then use the cockpit view on another. By doing this, you can both keep track of oncoming attacks and enjoy better accuracy shooting individual targets, and you can switch screens shown on the TV or gamepad at any time by pressing the select button. I'm conflicted on this when it comes to keeping track of multiple opponents at once, though, as it means you'll constantly be switching views just to ensure that you don't die a horrible fiery death. Where this setup works best is where you're facing a single opponent, such as this boss for example. You lock onto it on one screen to make sure you don't get hit by its attacks, and then on another screen you aim through the cockpit to accurately land your shots on its weak points. It's genuinely a well-made boss, but I completely understand why this would be disorienting regardless. Dividing your attention between two perspectives, even when pressing the select button to switch the views on one screen, takes your attention away from one style of play and asks you to quickly adjust to another. All the while, both are happening simultaneously and are equally important. In most battles, I do everything I can to avoid having to use both screens, such as the all-range battles like the one in Area 6. I just play it like I would Star Fox 64, albeit with more freedom to aim anywhere I like. The game is much more enjoyable without that added variable. I feel as though bosses need to be designed specifically for the simultaneous perspectives, and they need to scale back the amount of stuff to keep track of. Other bosses that do this well are the Gigarilla in your revisit to Corneria, in which you lock on in order to dodge on one screen, and then fly around, get a good angle on its weak point, and fire away. Andross only has you focus on one view at any given time, either flying around to avoid the lasers, or using the walker to dodge and shoot. I think this balance of both perspectives can invite cool game design, but in every other instance I found it too annoying to bother with. In something like The World Ends With You, a game that also uses two screens as part of its core game design, you not only have peripheral vision to keep track of both screens at once to an extent, but you also bounce the puck back and forth between screens so that you know exactly which one to focus on at any given time. And you'll build up a super move by doing this, giving you an advantage if you're having a hard time balancing all of the enemies on the field. Star Fox Zero asks a lot of the player in these situations, and I don't think the controls will immediately sink in. That said, I do enjoy the R-Wing's reticle being liberated from the direction the ship is pointing in. I think it does genuinely add a lot to the basic gameplay, so long as it doesn't demand the use of both perspectives. The Landmaster also uses this basic philosophy of separating the reticle and the vehicle, and I found that I adjusted to it more slowly than the R-Wing. This is where I began to see why the disconnect between vehicle and reticle would annoy some players. The Landmaster is landlocked once again. In order to aim at things, I need to look at the sky, but while I'm following my reticle, I'm not looking at my vehicle, because my reticle moves separately from the direction my vehicle is moving. The very thing that I thought made the R-Wing such a unique experience in this game was also a hurdle I had to climb over in order to enjoy the Landmaster. I did eventually climb that hurdle, but by extension, I could see how this disconnect could be an issue for people just trying to enjoy using the R-Wing, let alone the Landmaster. As you can see, the R-Wing isn't the only vehicle in this game. The Walker was finally resurrected from Star Fox 2 for this game, and I found it a lot of fun to mess with. I like running and hovering around levels with it, and the dodge is satisfying to use, especially in the fight against Andross. Again, it's important to reset your reticle frequently, but levels designed for the Walker's abilities add some variety into objectives you're fulfilling throughout the game. As for the Gyro Wing, why the hell are there stealth missions in a Star Fox game? This vehicle's existence reads entirely as a gimmick. It's not that it controls poorly or anything, it's just that these levels are pace breakers in the worst way possible. You know what I thought Star Fox needed? Slow, stealth-driven sections where you have to deploy a little robot that hacks panels. Thankfully, there aren't many of these instances throughout the game. All in all, I didn't hate the controls nearly as much as others did, though I can see why they would frustrate some. Also, this game is the first in the series since Star Fox 64 to actually reward you for skill and thinking outside of the box with alternate routes and secret levels. I missed this feeling so much. The only problem is that most of them only become available by first either completing missions further down the line, or by beating the main story altogether. So if you want to feel rewarded, you first have to acclimate to the controls by beating the game once. It's funny that I said Platinum Games was known for this kind of thing, but if you had a genuinely miserable time playing the game, you will most likely not even want to experience this stuff. Your first playthrough will likely just be you figuring out how the hell to control everything the game throws at you. Even so, it's worth mentioning. as I feel it had been missing from the series since Star Fox 64, which released 19 years prior to this game, mind you. Corneria has 2 alternate routes. The first is discoverable by turning into the walker during the first on-rails segment and stepping on this button here. Doing so will take you to a completely different boss and alternate level. Additionally, there's another way to defeat the primary boss in Corneria. If you take out the parts on the bottom, you can slip in with the walker in order to take down the core in that form. In Sector Beta, you can open a path to Fortuna if you defeat Wolf before Peppy takes damage. You can even play as Peppy if you beat Ficina and replay Titania with the Gravemaster upgrade. By flying into a portal that appears in Titania, you can take out an enemy armada as Peppy, who shouts barrel roll every single time he performs one. What's not to like? You can also unlock additional battles with Starwolf after completing the main story, and locking onto them when they appear. If there is a portal above a level on the world map, that means there's a route you can find in it. Again, the only problem with this structure is that it's not anything like charting a route in Star Fox 64. These levels are merely unlockables that have prerequisites that you most likely won't know about until after the story is over, or you're pretty far into it already. It does make replaying the game a lot more exciting, I can tell you that much, but it's not nearly the same as Star Fox 64. And speaking of that, there was this lingering feeling I had about this game that I just couldn't shake. Star Fox Zero was treated as a soft reboot of the series, nixing any established canon from previous games, which seemed like the right thing to do. At the same time, it is essentially a retelling and reimagining of Star Fox 64 in every way, right down to some of the dialogue being identical, and key story moments being recreated in the context of this game's design, such as the escape sequence with James McCloud. This is ironic because Star Fox 64 was already a fleshed out reimagining of the original Star Fox's narrative, so this game is a reimagining of a reimagining. With the observable and shameless adherence to Star Fox 64 in this game, I couldn't help but feel like I'd rather just play that game again, even with my appreciation of some aspects of the game's controls. It's admirable that the structure of this game returned to the biggest reason I fell in love with Star Fox 64, but it is also an entirely different, much more limited system in comparison. Moreover, I learned something when playing this game's cooperative mode with my brother. Co-op might be the best way to play Star Fox Zero, as the player on the gamepad only needs to focus on aiming, while the player with the Pro Controller can fly the R-Wing in a manner identical to Star Fox 64. No motion controls attached. While the gamepad player is the one that can charge up their shots, lock on, and fire bombs, the player flying the R-Wing can still shoot. They aren't just a defenseless pilot. And you know what? It feels great. The walker even controls well with the Pro Controller, and communicating with your buddy on the gamepad just gives you more time to focus on dodging while they shoot. Much like Star Fox Assault, I feel that Star Fox Zero at its core is far more enjoyable as a multiplayer game, intentional or otherwise. But when I was flying the R-Wing in a manner identical to Star Fox 64, having the time of my life, I found myself contemplating one simple question, and this question pretty much entirely disassembles Star Fox Zero's existence in the first place. My question is simply, why? Is there truly a need for the game to have these unorthodox control schemes when it is simultaneously trying so hard to evoke a game that is much better than it? Does this decision on its own warrant the game's existence? While some might find it truly does, others that found the controls awkward would be inclined to disagree. But at the end of the day, whether or not you agree with the decision to implement these controls, Star Fox Zero does little of anything to differentiate itself from its direct inspiration. A game that offers far more in its gameplay and structure, with little to no barrier of entry. And I think that is truly the game's fatal flaw. It's not the controls that kill it, at least not to me. It's the insistence on using them in a game that is simultaneously using nostalgia as its foundation. When you strip the core method of interfacing with this game away from it, all you are left with is a game that lives in the shadow of its predecessor, and with an interface as polarizing as this, just go play Star Fox 64. The notion of innovation and experimentation is not something I am opposed to, though. Experimentation is something that I think was essential to Zelda's continued success. After Ocarina of Time, every 3D Zelda aimed to be an entirely distinct experience, complete with different core gameplay loops, traversal methods, mechanics, atmospheres, and even structures. You can clearly see from my discussion of Zelda that I have no qualms with the notion of change, because it always makes sense in the context of that series. To this day, there isn't a single mainline Zelda game that I dislike, not even Zelda 2. Star Fox, on the other hand, had a couple of games that barely even resembled the game that people know and love. Star Fox Assault had bits and pieces of that game in it, but Star Fox Command pivoted into what was essentially a different game entirely. In that regard, I think Star Fox Zero came the closest to emulating how it felt to experience Star Fox 64's gameplay and structure. The only reason they dropped the ball is because the motion controls were baked into the game's core design, and they simply do not jive with everyone. While it has a decent effect on elevating its gameplay in some areas, as I discussed, I think a regular controller works just fine too.
Good luck.
Star Fox and the experiments it has been put through have been all over the place, but I do believe there is a lot to learn from what we have. All I can really put together is my own personal wish list from everything I've talked about. First of all, I think the paths you can take in Star Fox 64 should be a primary element in the next game. Reward players for performing well, and punish them for failing to achieve an objective by sending them to different levels. Have them think outside of the box with the abilities they know to find portals and other secret levels that can send them across the map. There's still so much to explore with this structure, and it should have served as the foundation for the entire franchise since. Moreover, when it comes to maturing the Star Fox world, have a branching narrative that draws players in and tugs on their heartstrings in the same breath as the fun and charming dialogue the series is known for. Let the player make grave mistakes that they have to live with on that playthrough, ones that adversely affect the entire Lylat system and the people that live in it, and allow them to redeem themselves by making important decisions and playing well throughout each level. We already had some moments like that in 64, such as when Slippy gets knocked out or when Bill and Cat return to help you in future levels. Imagine what it would be like if they expanded on this with a more robust and affecting narrative. I know this goes against Miyamoto's philosophy on story in his games, but who cares? This doesn't have to be his game. Here's the thing. A Fox in Space is a masterpiece. As fan fiction, it is excellent. As fiction, it is excellent. It exists in its own lived-in world, full of little details like commercials and Easter eggs, the atmospheric art direction and soundtrack, and the distinct voice acting. But it also fits itself into the established Star Fox canon elegantly, exploring unanswered questions that I had for years. Tonally, it should continue to exist in its own world. I don't think Star Fox needs a gritty, neon-soaked reboot like this. I love A Fox in Space as its own entity. But in terms of character writing and emotional story beats, I think Star Fox is long overdue for something like this, and implementing it in a structure like the one seen in Star Fox 64 would be incredible. Second, I want a deep multiplayer experience that builds on Star Fox Assault. Not just more deathmatch modes and maps, but co-op missions that have you working together, either on rails or in all-range mode, to defeat bosses and fulfill objectives together. This not only would add more replayability to an already versatile game structure, but between these two things, Star Fox has the potential to be something much greater. Something that can create memories through emergent gameplay and nail-biting deathmatches and co-op missions, in addition to the memories that come from a strong single-player campaign. Finally, I think there is a place for the motion controls in Star Fox Zero, at least somewhat. So long as they aren't baked into the core of the game's design, and they are entirely optional, I think giving players the chance to aim independently of their vehicle in most levels is a good thing, because I personally felt that freedom was a ton of fun to play with. Much like Splatoon and Breath of the Wild and any other game that features gyro aiming as a feature, it is also an entirely optional feature. As I said in my Wii retrospective, motion controls by themselves do not drive accessibility. Options do.
I've upgraded the hard points with gimbaled cannons.
Gimbal what?
Gimbaled, Peppy. They let you freely aim your shots, even if you're not flying in the same direction you want to shoot.
I don't think I want that. Can I turn that off?
Toggle switch behind the triggers if you just want them fixed.
My man.
Of course, these are all just the ramblings of a fan. The most I can do, as a fan of Star Fox and game design altogether, is discuss these elements with others, or perhaps even make my own game. Create art, write stories, and do whatever you can to show your love for this series, and the potential it still has. It's the most any of us can do, really. Perhaps one day, we will see these goobers take to the skies once again. I've been Liam Triforce. Thanks for watching.